She didn't call it that, though nobody ever does when they're the one leaving. Sia Lim said on a quiet Sunday afternoon that she needed someone operating at the same level she was. She said she had outgrown the dynamic, careful to add that she still cared about him regardless. What she actually needed, it turned out, was a man named Min Junyu instead. Min Junyu was heir to the country's largest private real estate firm, tall and effortlessly confident. He wore watches that cost more than cars without ever seeming to notice the cost himself. Sia had been photographed with him at 3 charity events before ending things at their kitchen table. Miho already knew about the photographs, though he had chosen never to mention them aloud. His name was Kong Miho, 26, a mid-level designer at a company nobody found beautiful but everyone used. He was genuinely good at his job, the kind senior engineers approached with problems they couldn't solve alone. By any visible metric, he was not operating at the same level as a man whose name sat on buildings. He told her simply that he understood, and something in her face visibly relaxed at once. That relief stayed with him longest afterward, longer than the breakup or the photographs themselves. It was as if his understanding had been the only obstacle she'd truly been worried about. He did not spend the following 2 years heartbroken exactly, though the first months were quietly miserable. Then he did what he always did when his environment stopped making sense, and built something new entirely. The something new became a design consultancy called Blank Studio, built on a simple, stubborn principle. Good design starts from nothing, from watching users fail before assuming what they actually need. Most teams began from a product's existing logic and smoothed its edges instead of questioning it. Year 1 brought 4 clients, all referred quietly by engineers who had watched him work firsthand. Year 2 brought 18 clients, a team of 6, and a reputation for fixing abandoned projects. By year 2's end, Blank Studio was acquired for a number that reshaped his entire sense of scale. He became 28 with more money than he'd ever imagined and a division head role besides. The acquiring company, Pionix Group, happened to be parent to a firm contracted by U Properties. He hadn't planned this coincidence, only decided, once it arrived, not to mention his history at all. He wanted, quietly, to see exactly how the situation would unfold without anyone knowing who he was. Sia's name appeared in his inbox one Tuesday under an agency called Meridian Creative instead. He recognized it after a brief search as the boutique firm she joined after going public with Minjun. The email requested a meeting about collaborating on the U Properties digital experience project together. Her profile photo matched his memory exactly, composed and precise, exactly as she'd always wanted to appear. He sat with the email for 3 days before finally agreeing to schedule the meeting. He didn't flag any names for his assistant, choosing instead to simply let the meeting happen. The meeting took place in Blank Studio's own space, preserved intact after the acquisition deliberately. It was understated by design, concrete floors and real books, a room that communicated without announcing itself. He wasn't performing incompetence, only wearing his usual clothes and letting his calendar name stay vague. The listing simply read Miho, studio lead, an internal shorthand he chose not to correct. He was curious, quietly, about what might happen once she walked through that door. She arrived exactly on time, composed and professionally warm, assessing the room within seconds of entering. She did not wear the apologetic expression from their old kitchen table, only careful, measured confidence. Behind her came 2 junior staff members, and 1 step behind them came Minjun himself. He hadn't expected Minjun to attend, and processed the surprise in barely half a second. Minjun looked exactly like his photographs, tall and composed, holding Sia's hand with practiced comfort. Miho welcomed them simply, and Sia showed no flicker of recognition as introductions were made. She introduced herself and Minjun professionally, and Miho shook his hand while holding his gaze briefly. Minjun seemed polite but distracted, the attention of a man used to others handling creative details. Sia's presentation, once it began, was objectively strong and uncomfortably familiar in its underlying philosophy. She called it navigational luxury, the idea that premium experiences should anticipate rather than simply respond. Miho recognized the concept instantly as nearly identical to his own methodology under a different name. He asked about her baseline assumption, and she explained starting from failure rather than existing brand logic. Internally, something shifted in his chest, recognizing his own published words reflected back without credit. He wondered whether she'd read his old piece and forgotten it, or never connected it to him at all. He asked a pointed technical question, and she answered competently without any hint of recognition surfacing. He filed the observation quietly and continued the meeting as though nothing unusual had occurred. Minjun spoke up near the end, asking Miho directly about the project's realistic conceptual timeline. Miho answered 4 weeks, and Sia simultaneously answered 6, both looking at each other briefly. Minjun noted that Miho clearly had a specific point of view, recalibrating his attention accordingly. Miho replied that having a point of view was exactly what clients paid a consultancy for. Sia watched the exchange with an expression Miho couldn't quite place from across the table. The meeting closed with professional handshakes, and Miho walked the group toward the elevator himself. Minjun handed him a personal card, asking to be contacted directly rather than through layers. Sia lingered a moment, studying Miho as though trying to place a reference she couldn't locate. She called him very direct for a studio lead, and he replied that directness usually served design well. She left slightly off balance, promising to send the brief later that same afternoon. Miho stood alone in the lobby, considering 2 years of work and a woman who still didn't recognize him. The brief arrived that afternoon, thorough and well-constructed, exactly as he expected from her. Reading it 3 times, he noticed 7 distinct places where her thinking mirrored his own published work. It wasn't plagiarism exactly, since design philosophy spreads freely once it enters public conversation. Either she had absorbed his writing unknowingly, or her agency's culture had absorbed it and shaped her instead. He replied with 3 pointed questions about the user research sample, deliberately precise and revealing. She answered within the hour, remarking that most collaborators asked about brand guidelines first instead. He replied that guidelines were downstream of users, and her response paused far longer than before. She admitted that description matched their own methodology almost exactly, and he agreed they'd likely work well together. He understood now that she was interested in the collaboration itself, not yet in him personally. He recognized this would become considerably more complicated than he had originally anticipated at the start. The project formally began 3 weeks later, with 2 of his best designers assigned directly. He attended joint sessions himself, staying close to the user research process where insight always lived. Sia proved to be a genuinely excellent collaborator, quieter and more considered than he remembered. She listened to research findings without rushing toward conclusions she had already privately decided upon. In the second session, she challenged his team's framework with 3 sharp clarifying questions instead of alternatives. She pointed out they were designing for transaction completion when users actually wanted permission to stop. He admitted she was right immediately, and she looked slightly startled by his lack of defensiveness. She remarked that most studio leads treated corrections as threats rather than useful information. He said only the bad ones did, and she admitted she'd met more bad ones than she'd like. Minjun attended the 3rd session, listening quietly and asking questions rooted in business logic rather than design. Afterward, he pulled Miho aside, praising the framework's direction and noting where the creative authority truly sat. Miho insisted they were building it together, resisting the idea of any single driving seat. Minjun studied him with the flat attention of a man and used to disagreement, then let it go. Something shifted in how Sia regarded Miho after that session, subtle but undeniably present. She began staying after sessions longer, debriefing in the specific shorthand of people doing difficult work together. She noted he always asked what users feared rather than what they wanted, and asked him why. He explained that fear was more honest than desire, since people manage desire but rarely manage fear. She asked where he'd learned that, and he credited experience and some reading, deliberately vague. She mentioned a design journal piece from years earlier that shaped much of Meridian's own methodology. He asked if she knew the author, and she said the author had gone quiet after publishing it. He suggested the author might simply have been busy building something instead of writing more. She looked at him with a question forming that she ultimately chose not to ask aloud. Minjun, it turned out, had also been quietly watching the dynamic develop across several weeks. He began directing pointed questions at Miho, testing honesty rather than testing actual design knowledge. Miho answered everything truthfully, having built his entire company on the value of honest uncertainty. After a long session, Minjun noted plainly that Miho had built Blank Studio entirely from scratch. Miho confirmed it, and Minjun asked what had made him believe it would eventually work. Miho said he hadn't believed it would work, only that it was worth building regardless of outcome. Minjun mentioned that Sia had said Miho reminded her of someone she used to know. Miho kept his expression steady, replying that he simply had a common kind of face. Minjun noted she wasn't usually imprecise with her observations, then let the comment go for now. Miho drove home that night feeling like a man surrounded by carefully mapped motion sensors, one just triggered. In week 7 they reviewed the final framework together, alone after the rest of the team left. Seoha frowned at a transition point that had already been revised 3 separate times before. Miho explained the real problem was assuming users wanted completion when they actually wanted permission to pause. She agreed instantly, asking how long he'd known that particular insight about user behavior. He admitted he'd known since the second session but hadn't found the right framing until now. She asked directly whether their aligned thinking was coincidence or something deeper neither had named yet. He suggested good ideas simply spread, deliberately leaving the deeper explanation unspoken between them. She mentioned someone from years earlier who thought about problems exactly the way he did. She admitted she had significantly underestimated that person and had been thinking about it since. He asked what happened to that person, and she said simply that she had left him. She had left for something that felt more certain at the time, though she now doubted the criteria. He suggested sometimes the certain thing and the right thing turn out to be different entirely. She agreed quietly, and they finished the transition point before finally deciding to go home separately. That night he sat alone, honestly weighing what he felt against what he was actually doing. The two didn't align, and he recognized that clearly without yet knowing how to resolve it. Minjun called his personal cell one Thursday, requesting dinner outside any project context entirely. They met at an exclusive restaurant where Minjun clearly belonged without needing to think about it. Over the second course Minjun set down his fork and asked if Miho had known Seoha before. Miho asked what made him think that, and Minjun described a very specific pattern of not noticing. He explained Miho never looked at Seoha first upon entering a room, unlike typical professional collaborators. Miho admitted they had been together 2 years earlier, before Blank Studio existed at all. Minjun asked if she had ended it, and Miho confirmed that she had, for him specifically. Minjun set his fork down again, quietly processing something he had suspected but not fully confirmed. He asked if she knew who Miho truly was, and Miho admitted she still didn't. Minjun asked what exactly Miho was doing then, genuinely curious rather than confrontational about it. Miho explained he needed to know whether she believed the level comment about him or the circumstances. He mentioned she'd admitted underestimating someone without realizing she was speaking directly to that person. Minjun revealed he and Seoha had actually ended things mutually 4 months earlier without any drama. He explained they worked better as professional partners than as anything more personal between them. He said Seoha's admission wasn't from a happy woman reflecting casually, but someone alone and genuinely thinking. Miho sat with this new information, absorbing the shift in what he thought he understood. Minjun said Miho had built something extraordinary while pretending to be less than he actually was. He suggested someone in the situation eventually needed to say something honest and direct about it. Miho agreed but admitted he hadn't decided exactly when or how he would do that. Minjun advised deciding quickly, noting these situations rarely stayed quietly contained for very long. The executive presentation arrived 3 weeks later, 23U Properties leaders filling the room. Seoha presented the brand and experience philosophy while Miho presented the technical implementation framework. The presentation went well, generating implementation questions rather than doubts about whether to proceed at all. At the end Minjun asked where the shared methodology, starting from failure modes, had originally come from. Seoha explained carefully that a design journal piece had shaped Meridian's thinking years earlier. Minjun asked gently what piece exactly, and she mentioned the author had used a pen name. She added that the methodology had been developed professionally by a firm called Blank Studio. The room went completely quiet as her expression shifted, slowly assembling something she'd been carrying separately. She looked directly at Miho, and this time there was an unmistakable flicker of recognition. The U Properties team filtered out slowly, and Minjun left last, sensing the moment required privacy. Only Seoha and Miho remained in the room, standing at opposite ends of the table. She said the name Blank Studio aloud, and he confirmed simply that yes, he had founded it. She confirmed the timeline 2 years earlier, and he confirmed that detail as well. She realized the journal piece belonged to him, and he confirmed he'd recognized her methodology immediately. She asked why he hadn't said anything back in the very first meeting they'd shared. He explained he wanted to know who she was when she didn't know who he was. He wanted to understand whether her old comment about levels was about him or about circumstance. He told her she'd read his work and built her own methodology without ever knowing it was his. He said she'd spent 9 weeks telling him he resembled someone who once impressed her deeply. He said he now believed the level question had always been about what he lacked, not who he was. She asked quietly whether the past 9 weeks of work had been genuinely real at all. He confirmed every note and framework had been completely real, untouched by the personal history beneath it. She asked if he'd been watching her the whole time, and he confirmed that yes, he had. She asked if she was a different person now, and he said she was noticeably better. He called her more patient, more willing to be wrong, more interested in truth than appearance. 2 nights before the presentation, he had decided not to let this resolve quietly at all. He hadn't built something real just to let the moment pass unspoken and unacknowledged. The executive reception happened that same evening. 30 guests relaxed after the successful presentation itself. He waited until the room reached its social peak before asking quietly for everyone's attention. He explained the project's success and credited Siaha's thinking as central to its final direction. He revealed they had known each other years earlier, together for 2 years before parting ways. He explained she had ended things because she needed someone operating at a different level entirely. He described building Blank Studio afterward, eventually acquired for a number he let the room imagine. He explained spending 9 weeks anonymously watching her present his own methodology back to him unknowingly. He said the level she'd needed had apparently always existed, hidden beneath what he simply hadn't built yet. He suggested anyone ever told they weren't enough might simply be building something not yet visible. He thanked the room, praised the collaboration once more, and excused himself before walking out entirely. In the corridor, Minjun followed him quietly, asking simply how he felt after saying all that. Miho admitted it felt like saying something true in a room full of people, brave or foolish. Minjun said those 2 things weren't always different from each other, and Miho agreed completely. He told Miho that Siaha would follow him out into the corridor within a few minutes. She arrived 4 minutes later, composed and having clearly decided to be honest rather than defensive. She called what he'd done cruel, and he agreed it partly had been, without denying it. She asked why he hadn't simply told her privately instead of announcing it publicly like that. He said she'd told him he wasn't enough somewhere no one else was watching, so he answered similarly. She admitted that was fair, surprising him slightly with how readily she accepted the point. She admitted she'd measured him against the wrong standard entirely, one built from expectation rather than truth. She apologized for the kitchen table, for the years he'd spent building while she looked elsewhere. He accepted the apology and said he was glad she was doing better work now, for herself. She asked if that was everything, and he said for tonight, yes, that was all. She asked about beyond tonight, and he said he needed time to understand what came next. He explained he didn't want to repeat the same pattern with the variables simply rearranged. She agreed that was fair too, and he complimented the project's success once more sincerely. He walked to the elevator, and the doors closed behind him without further conversation that night. The U Properties project launched 8 months later to strong reception across design industry circles. Both firms credited the collaboration prominently, and the work proved worth every week it demanded. Minjun called a month after launch to discuss a new project, entirely professional in tone. He mentioned Siaha had called him afterward, asking if Miho was serious about needing time. Minjun told her he believed Miho was serious about most things he committed to seriously. He added that people who build something real from nothing tend toward patience rather than impulse. Siaha emailed 3 weeks later, admitting she'd been thinking carefully about what he'd said that night. She wrote that she believed she was different enough now to be worth discovering properly. She asked, simply, if he was willing to find out alongside her going forward. He read the message twice, thinking of the kitchen table, the reception room, and 9 long weeks. He remembered her attention across every session, sharp and honest, unafraid of being wrong aloud. He replied with 4 words only, suggesting coffee together on Saturday morning at 10. She replied within a minute, saying simply that she would absolutely be there waiting. He set down his phone, having built something from nothing, and finally said what needed saying. What came next wasn't a proof or a point anymore, just 2 people with accurate information now. For the first time, that felt like more than enough for either of them.